The Celtic warriors fell in waves across the Gallic hillside, their bodies broken against Roman shields and disciplined iron. Blood turned the autumn grass dark while Caesar's legions pushed forward with mechanical precision. Victory seemed assured by the 7th hour of battle. Then something impossible stopped the Roman advance. A single druid emerged from the retreating Celtic forces, arms raised toward the afternoon sky. He wore no armour, carried no weapon, and yet every soldier within sight felt their courage falter. The man spoke in a language older than Latin, his voice carrying across the battlefield with unnatural clarity. He pointed at the sun with one hand and swept the other across the horizon as if tracing invisible lines through the air. The solar eclipse began exactly as his gesture completed. Darkness swallowed the battlefield in the middle of the afternoon. Roman soldiers dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, convinced the gods themselves had turned against them. The Celts roared in triumph and surged forward with renewed fury. Caesar's disciplined formations shattered into chaos as men screamed about divine punishment and celestial omens. Marcus Varro watched from the command hill, his scholar's mind refusing to accept supernatural intervention. The eclipse had been predicted, but not by Roman astronomers. The timing was too precise, the Druids' confidence too absolute. Someone among these supposedly primitive tribes had calculated the celestial mechanics with perfect accuracy. The battle ended in Roman victory despite the panic, but Varro couldn't dismiss what he'd witnessed. That evening, while soldiers looted the Celtic camp, he searched for something more valuable than gold. The Druid's tent contained no idols or magical implements. Instead, Varro found carefully arranged stones marked with symbols he'd never encountered in any Greek or Egyptian text. The marks formed patterns that resembled astronomical charts. Each stone bore etchings showing planetary positions, stellar constellations, and mathematical calculations rendered in an unknown notation system. Varro counted backward through the positions and realized these charts tracked celestial movements across decades. No oral tradition could maintain such precision without written records, yet the Celts famously refused to commit their knowledge to permanent form. He confiscated everything and brought it to Caesar's tent. The general dismissed the discovery as tribal superstition, more interested in counting captured territories than contemplating barbarian astronomy. Varro received permission to question captured druids, though Caesar warned him not to waste time on primitive mysticism. The interrogation chamber held 3 druids bound in iron chains. The eldest among them showed no fear despite the certainty of execution. His eyes held something Varro had seen only in the most learned philosophers of Athens, the calm certainty of someone who possessed answers rather than questions. If you're watching this journey through history's mysteries, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're experiencing this story. Your likes help us continue uncovering the secrets that textbooks forgot. Now, back to the moment that would change everything Varro thought he knew about civilization itself. Varro began with simple questions about the eclipse prediction. The elder druid smiled and explained that his people had tracked such events for countless generations. The celestial cycles repeated in patterns that required no mysticism, only patient observation and mathematical understanding. When Varro asked how illiterate tribes maintained such precise records, the druid's expression shifted to something resembling pity for Roman ignorance. Memory, the old man said, was more permanent than any scroll or tablet. His people trained for 20 years to preserve knowledge in living minds, passing it through chains of teachers that stretched back beyond counting. The calculations existed in verse and song, encoded in rhythms that made forgetting impossible. What Romans wrote on fragile papyrus, the Druids carried in neural pathways developed through rigorous mental discipline. Varro pressed harder, demanding to know where such advanced astronomy originated. The druid's answer changed everything. He spoke of a western isle that had sunk beneath the ocean, generations beyond memory, a land where his distant ancestors had built temples to study the stars. 12 survivors had fled the drowning, carrying scrolls and knowledge to the northern mists. The Druids weren't primitive mystics discovering truth through gradual enlightenment. They were custodians of a shattered civilization's remnants. The claim seemed absurd until Varro examined the confiscated stones more carefully. The mathematical notation system shared properties with Egyptian hieratic numerals, but showed differences suggesting independent development or perhaps common ancestry. The astronomical observations included calculations for planetary movements that Greek scholars had only recently begun to understand. Most disturbing, several stones showed positions of stars as they appeared from latitudes far south of Gaul, positions corresponding to Mediterranean or even more southern locations. Varro spent weeks documenting everything before Caesar's army moved to the next campaign. He interviewed more captured Druids, finding consistent accounts of inherited knowledge from those who fled the flood. They spoke of stone circles raised as memory devices, each monument encoding information about celestial mechanics and terrestrial geography. The structures served as both calendar and classroom, allowing initiates to calculate seasons, predict astronomical events, and navigate vast distances without written instruments. The scholar travelled to several megalithic sites under Roman guard. What he found defied explanation. Stonehenge aligned with solar and lunar cycles with engineering precision that required understanding of geometry far beyond simple sun watching. The massive stones came from quarries hundreds of miles distant, transported and erected through methods that suggested knowledge of leverage, force calculation, and cooperative engineering on a scale Romans associated with their own empire. Local Druids explained that their ancestors hadn't built Stonehenge. They had inherited it from earlier peoples who possessed even greater knowledge. The monuments predated living memory, erected by the first teachers who came from the sunken western land. Each stone marked specific astronomical alignments, and the complete circle functioned as a computational device for tracking celestial cycles across centuries. Varro measured the angles and distances himself. The summer solstice sunrise aligned through specific stone pairs with exactitude that required precise surveying tools and mathematical planning. The winter solstice showed equally perfect alignment. Lunar cycles, eclipse predictions, and even planetary positions could be tracked using the monument's geometry. This wasn't religious architecture. It was a scientific instrument built in stone. The implications shook Varro's understanding of history. Roman civilization prided itself on advancing beyond barbarism, bringing order and knowledge to primitive lands. Yet here stood evidence of astronomical sophistication predating Rome by potentially thousands of years, preserved by tribes Rome considered savage. He documented measurements for 19 separate megalithic structures across Gaul and Britain. Each showed similar precision in celestial alignment. Each represented engineering accomplishments that required coordinated effort, advanced mathematics, and long-term planning. The distribution suggested not isolated achievements, but a connected network of knowledge, as if some earlier civilization had erected these monuments according to a unified plan. The Druids explained their role as rememberers rather than inventors. They preserved calculations and observations accumulated over countless generations, maintaining accuracy through rigorous oral tradition. When Varro asked why they didn't write their knowledge for easier transmission, the elder Druid's answer revealed deeper wisdom. Writing could be burned, scrolls could rot, tablets could shatter. Their ancestors had learned this truth when their homeland sank. But knowledge embedded in human memory, reinforced through song and ritual, survived catastrophes that destroyed physical records. Varro pressed the elder about this sunken homeland. The description matched accounts from Greek philosophy almost perfectly. A great island civilization in the Western Ocean, advanced in astronomy and architecture, destroyed by sudden catastrophe when the land collapsed into the sea. The timeline placed the destruction impossibly far in the past, 9,000 years before Varro's own time, according to Druidic chronology, maintained through generational counting. The scholar knew of Plato's Atlantis dialogues, written centuries earlier. He dismissed them as philosophical allegory, mythical constructs designed to illustrate political theories. Yet here stood physical evidence supporting the core claims: astronomical knowledge, megalithic engineering, and oral traditions describing maritime refugees from a Western catastrophe. Caesar's legions prepared to depart for Rome, their Gallic conquest complete. Varro gathered his notes and confiscated artifacts, intending to present his findings to philosophical schools in the capital. The elder Druid called out as guards led him to execution, warning that Rome would fall as their own civilization had fallen. Knowledge preserved in writing would burn with the libraries. Only that which lived in human minds would survive the coming darkness. The prophecy proved prescient centuries later, but Varro never witnessed Rome's collapse. He returned to the capital and presented his evidence to scholars at the Forum. Most dismissed his claims as barbarian superstition given too much credence. A few recognized the significance but lacked framework to accept such radical revision of human history. Varro's documentation disappeared into private libraries, his findings considered too controversial for public discourse. Roman pride couldn't accommodate the possibility that Celtic Druids preserved knowledge surpassing imperial achievements. The astronomical stones became curiosities in wealthy collectors' estates. The careful measurements and calculations were filed away and gradually forgotten. But Varro had planted seeds that would germinate across centuries. His notes mention the Druids' claim about 12 survivors carrying knowledge northward from a drowned land. The astronomical precision of megalithic monuments remained undeniable, regardless of Roman skepticism. The question hung unanswered. Where had such knowledge originated, if not through gradual Celtic development? The Druids themselves began disappearing under Roman occupation. Their oral traditions faced systematic destruction, as conquerors banned their schools and executed their teachers. The knowledge that had survived for thousands of years through careful memorization now faced extinction within generations. Each executed elder represented libraries' worth of astronomy, mathematics, and historical memory erased forever. Some Druids fled to remote regions beyond Roman control. Ireland and Scotland's northern reaches became refuges for the remaining knowledge keepers. They continued their 20-year training cycles in hidden groves, maintaining the old practices while Roman roads carved through their former territories. The megalithic monuments stood abandoned, their purposes forgotten by common people who now feared them as giants' work or demons' temples. Varro died without seeing his discoveries validated. His final writings repeated the elder Druids' warning about civilizations rising and falling, while essential knowledge hung by fragile threads. He noted that humanity had perhaps achieved greatness before, only to lose it through catastrophe and begin again from ignorance. The Druids represented a living link to that lost past, and Rome was severing the connection without understanding what it destroyed. The astronomical calculations and star charts disappeared into history's shadows. Libraries burned, estates were looted, and private collections scattered across the fragmenting empire. The evidence that might have proved Druidic claims became footnotes in accounts of Caesar's conquests, dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings by a scholar too credulous of barbarian tales. Yet the megaliths remained, silent and enduring. Stone circles continued marking solstices with perfect precision. Passage tombs aligned to winter sunrise regardless of who understood their purpose. The monuments themselves became evidence that waited for future generations to interpret, physical proof that Varro's observations had captured something genuine beneath the surface of Roman assumptions. The question persisted across the following centuries, buried but not extinguished. Had the Druids truly inherited knowledge from a vanished civilization? Did their astronomical precision and engineering monuments represent preserved wisdom from some Atlantic catastrophe lost to prehistory? Or had Varro witnessed an elaborate deception, barbarian tricks designed to intimidate conquering armies with false claims of ancient glory? The answers lay scattered across conquered territories in standing stones and oral fragments, waiting for patient investigation. The elder Druids' final words echoed through time, challenging civilizations that followed Rome to consider whether human achievement moved in straight lines or cycles. Perhaps greatness had already been reached and lost. Perhaps what seemed primitive contained remnants of sophistication that modern empires couldn't match. Varro's documentation survived in scattered references and secondary sources, enough to preserve the essential mystery. Celtic Druids possessed knowledge they claimed came from those who fled a western flood. They built nothing new but maintained monuments and calculations inherited from earlier peoples. They remembered when others forgot, preserved what others lost, and maintained chains of knowledge through methods that Rome considered inferior to writing. The first chapter of the mystery closed with Varro's death and the Druidic school's suppression, but the evidence remained, embedded in landscape and legend, waiting for fresh eyes to recognize patterns that challenged convenient historical narratives. The story of possible Atlantean inheritance had only begun. The Russian officer stared into the darkness and felt his certainty crumble. His regiment had been mapping the Altai Mountains for 3 months, charting territories newly claimed by the Tsar. What they found that morning in 1867 shouldn't exist according to any military manual or geographical text. The entrance gaped in the mountainside like a wound, revealed by a recent landslide. Initial exploration suggested a natural cave system. 20 meters inside, the tunnels became too regular, too geometric. The walls met the ceiling at precise 90-degree angles. Ventilation shafts pierced upward at measured intervals, still drawing air after unknown centuries. The first chamber extended 40 meters across, its ceiling supported by carved pillars that showed no tool marks matching Russian, Chinese, or Mongolian techniques. Storage alcoves lined the walls, their shelves cut directly from living rock. Water channels ran along the floor, sloping at gradients calculated for consistent flow. This wasn't a shelter or a mine. Someone had engineered an underground city. Subsequent rooms revealed even more troubling sophistication. The expedition found living quarters with stone furniture built into the walls, workshop spaces with slag residue indicating metalworking, and what appeared to be communal gathering areas with acoustic properties that amplified sound from specific points. Population estimates suggested the complex could house 3,000 people for extended periods. The mapping expedition discovered 14 similar sites within the next 2 years. Each showed identical construction techniques despite being separated by dozens of miles. The consistency implied centralized planning and coordinated labor forces. More disturbing was the apparent age. Geological analysis of sediment accumulation suggested the sites predated Russian expansion into Siberia by at least a millennium. Reports reached St. Petersburg and promptly vanished into bureaucratic archives. The findings contradicted established narratives about Central Asian primitiveness. Russian imperial ideology depended on portraying steppe peoples as barbaric nomads requiring European civilization. Evidence of sophisticated indigenous engineering undermined justifications for conquest. Independent explorers continued the work regardless of official disinterest. In 1872, a Swedish geologist named Anders Norberg investigated ancient mining operations in the Sayan Mountains. The mine shafts descended 200 meters into granite bedrock, following ore veins with precision that suggested metallurgical knowledge and geological understanding. Support timbers had long since rotted away, but the placement of their anchor points showed systematic approach to preventing collapse. Norberg's most unsettling discovery came from metallurgical analysis of slag heaps outside the mines. The residue contained traces of deliberate alloying, bronze with specific tin ratios, and steel showing evidence of controlled carbon content. Creating such alloys required sustained temperatures exceeding 1200 degrees Celsius and precise understanding of metallurgical chemistry. Nomadic peoples didn't build the furnaces necessary for such work. The finds multiplied as Russian expansion accelerated. Engineers constructing the Trans-Siberian Railway uncovered massive stone foundations every few hundred kilometers. The foundations showed no connection to later Mongol, Chinese or Russian construction. Their placement seemed strategic, positioned to control mountain passes and river crossings. Military analysts recognized the pattern. These were fortress sites, part of a defensive network spanning thousands of miles. Chinese historical archives revealed corroborating evidence once scholars began searching for it. Han Dynasty records from 100 BCE described northern peoples possessing walled cities with permanent populations. The accounts mentioned specific construction techniques using rammed earth and stone facing, exactly matching the foundations Russian engineers kept discovering. Tang Dynasty sources went further, describing the Gökturks as maintaining administrative centres with bureaucratic archives and specialised craftsmen. The Scythian evidence demanded reconsideration in light of the underground cities. Herodotus had written about agricultural Scythians and royal Scythians in the 5th century BCE, describing a stratified society with multiple economic systems. 19th century excavations of Scythian burial mounds revealed artifacts supporting this complexity. The golden objects showed workshop techniques requiring years of stationary practice, granulation, filigree, cloisonné work that mobile pastoralists couldn't develop. A burial mound opened in 1873 near the Dnieper River yielded a golden pectoral depicting Scythian daily life in remarkable detail. The imagery showed not just warriors and herders, but craftsmen, farmers, and what appeared to be administrators or priests. These scenes contradicted everything scholars believed about purely nomadic culture. More troubling were the metallurgical techniques. The gold contained platinum group metals that required processing temperatures achievable only in specialized furnaces. Greek pottery found in the same excavations depicted Scythians wearing elaborate clothing and using sophisticated equipment. One amphora showed Scythian warriors with composite bows, scale armour, and what appeared to be siege equipment. Another depicted a Scythian settlement with permanent structures and defensive walls. The Greeks, who traded extensively with the Scythians, apparently saw them as civilized neighbours rather than barbaric nomads. Trade goods from Scythian sites revealed networks spanning continents. Tin from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli from Tajikistan, amber from the Baltic, silk from China. The variety proved organisational capacity across enormous distances. Such trade networks required stable political structures, standardised weights and measures, and some form of contract enforcement. Chaos and constant warfare couldn't sustain them. Kazakhstan yielded the most paradigm-shattering discoveries. Soviet archaeologists excavating in the 1950s uncovered Bronze Age settlements with populations in the tens of thousands. The sites dated between 2000 and 1500 BCE, contemporary with the height of Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations. Urban planning showed deliberate design, streets forming regular grids, craft quarters clustered by specialty, fortification walls incorporating defensive towers at precise intervals. The settlement at Archaeum, discovered in 1987, forced complete reassessment of Bronze Age Central Asia. The site featured concentric circular walls, radial streets, and sophisticated water management systems including wells, drainage channels, and what appeared to be sewage disposal. Metallurgical workshops showed evidence of bronze casting, pottery kilns demonstrated controlled firing temperatures, and granaries suggested agricultural surplus storage. Carbon dating placed Archaeum's construction around 2000 BCE, making it contemporary with the earliest Indo-European migrations. The implications exploded across archaeological discourse. If Central Asian peoples built sophisticated cities during the Bronze Age, they weren't peripheral barbarians receiving civilization from elsewhere. They developed urban culture independently, parallel to developments in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. More settlements emerged as Soviet archaeologists expanded their surveys. The Sintashta culture, named after the type site, showed even more advanced capabilities. Excavations revealed chariot workshops with standardized wheel dimensions, indicating mass production rather than individual craft. The chariots predated similar vehicles in the Near East by several centuries, suggesting Central Asia might have originated the technology rather than importing it. Fortification analysis revealed military engineering sophistication. The defensive walls incorporated bastions positioned for overlapping fields of fire, exactly as later military treatises would recommend. Ditch and rampart systems showed understanding of siege warfare and defensive depth. These weren't improvised fortifications, but carefully designed defensive networks, requiring mathematical knowledge and coordinated construction. The sites showed evidence of specialization that contradicted nomadic models entirely. Distinct workshop areas for metallurgy, pottery, textile production, and food processing appeared in every settlement. Craft specialization required population density and agricultural surplus to support non-food producing workers. The economic complexity rivaled contemporary Near Eastern cities. Irrigation systems extended miles beyond the settlement walls. Channels carried water from distant sources, maintaining gradients that prevented both stagnation and erosion. The engineering required surveying instruments and mathematical calculations. Archaeological teams found what appeared to be measuring rods and plumb bobs in administrative buildings, tools for precise construction work. Climate studies revealed why these settlements eventually failed. Paleoclimatic data showed Central Asia experiencing severe drought beginning around 2200 BCE. Lake levels dropped dramatically, river flows decreased, and grasslands transformed into desert. The environmental catastrophe matched the archaeological evidence. Settlements abandoned en masse, populations dispersing, urban centres collapsing within generations. But the drought didn't erase the knowledge. Underground storage in the Altai sites suggested populations retreating to protected locations, preserving what they could of their civilization. The consistency of later metallurgical techniques across vast distances implied knowledge transmission through centuries of hardship. Mobile pastoralism became adaptation strategy rather than cultural default. Linguistic evidence supported continuity rather than complete collapse. Turkic languages contain vocabulary for urban life, administrative hierarchy, and specialized crafts that appeared as ancient roots rather than recent borrowings. The words for fortress, bronze, forge, and measure showed common origins across languages separated by thousands of miles. Knowledge survived through oral transmission even when material culture simplified. Russian explorers in the 19th century encountered tribal specialists who possessed technical knowledge they couldn't explain. Certain families maintained metalworking techniques requiring precise temperature control and alloying ratios. Others knew astronomical observations allowing accurate calendrical calculations. When asked how they learned these skills, the specialists invariably claimed inheritance from ancient ancestors. The Uyghur territories revealed particularly dense concentrations of ancient sites. Ruins dotted the Tarim Basin, many showing construction techniques predating Chinese expansion westward. The buildings used mud brick with wooden reinforcement, a technique appearing in the region centuries before Han Dynasty contact. Trade goods found at these sites included jade from Siberia and silk apparently produced locally, suggesting indigenous craft development. The Tarim mummies complicated matters further. Bodies preserved by the desert climate showed European physical features: red and blonde hair, high-bridged noses, tall stature. Carbon dating placed them around 2000 BCE, contemporary with the Bronze Age settlements in Kazakhstan. Their clothing showed advanced weaving techniques with tartan patterns, and grave goods included sophisticated metal tools and wooden artifacts with carved decorations. Genetic analysis revealed the mummies carried a mixture of Eastern and Western ancestries, suggesting they belonged to populations moving freely across enormous distances. This wasn't gradual gene flow from separate populations, but evidence of established networks, allowing intermarriage across thousands of miles. Political stability over long periods was the only explanation for such genetic mixing. Chinese historical records suddenly made sense in this context. Descriptions of red-haired, green-eyed northern peoples weren't mythological embellishments, but accurate observations of mixed populations. The historical puzzle pieces assembled into a coherent picture, a Bronze Age civilization spanning the steppes, incorporating diverse populations into shared cultural and technological systems. The underground cities represented the final refuges. As climate catastrophe destroyed surface settlements, populations retreated to prepared shelters in mountain regions less affected by drought. These became repositories of knowledge, places where specialists maintained their skills through generations of hardship. The cities weren't temporary shelters but designed sanctuaries, built specifically to preserve civilization through environmental collapse. Archaeological evidence showed the underground sites remained occupied for centuries after the surface settlements were abandoned. Pottery styles evolved, metallurgical techniques refined, and architectural modifications appeared in stratigraphic layers. The inhabitants weren't simply surviving, they were adapting, maintaining technological capabilities while developing new survival strategies. The revelation transformed understanding of steppe history. The periodic eruptions of powerful confederations, Scythians, Xiongnu, Guk Turks, Mongols, weren't mysterious emergencies of nomadic power. They represented moments when populations preserving ancient knowledge successfully reunified, reactivating organizational systems and technical capabilities inherited from Bronze Age ancestors. Genghis Khan's conquests appeared less miraculous in this framework. His administrative systems, postal networks, and military organization weren't innovations but recoveries. The Mongol Empire reactivated ancient infrastructure, using roads and communication networks that had existed for millennia. The speed of Mongol expansion reflected rediscovery rather than invention, reconnecting fragments of a civilization that had never completely disappeared. The German linguist stared at his comparison charts and realized the pattern couldn't be coincidence. Wilhelm Schott had spent 15 years analyzing Turkic, Mongolic and Tungusic languages for the Berlin Academy of Sciences. His findings in 1849 challenged everything comparative linguistics assumed about Central Asian language development. Words for advanced concepts appeared with identical roots across language families separated by thousands of miles. The term for fortress showed clear cognates in Turkic, Mongolic and Tungusis, despite these groups supposedly having minimal historical contact. More troubling were technical vocabularies: metallurgy, irrigation, administrative hierarchy, astronomical observation, all displaying shared linguistic ancestry rather than recent borrowing. Language families diverged through isolation and time. Shared vocabulary indicated either common origin or sustained contact allowing word transmission. The geographic distribution made sustained contact implausible. Turkic speakers dominated western steppes. Mongolic peoples controlled central regions. Tungusic groups inhabited eastern forests. Natural barriers separated them: mountain ranges, deserts, vast distances that limited interaction. Yet the linguistic evidence demanded common source. Schott's analysis suggested these language families split from a proto-language around 2000 BCE, exactly matching the Bronze Age settlement collapse revealed by archaeology. The correlation implied a single civilization spanning the steppes, its fragmentation creating the language diversity observed in modern populations. More disturbing were the words themselves. Ancient Turkic possessed terms for city wall, bronze foundry, and irrigation canal as fundamental vocabulary rather than later additions. Mongolic languages contained proto-words for measurement, calendar, and written record, dating to periods when conventional history claimed these peoples lived in portable tents. The vocabulary preserved memories of capabilities their speakers no longer possessed. Etymological analysis revealed layers of meaning that told a story. The Turkic word for king derived from a root meaning stone builder. The Mongolic term for empire connected to words for measured land. Tungusic languages used compounds linking authority with knowledge of stars. The linguistic fossils pointed toward a civilization that defined power through construction, organization, and astronomical understanding. Russian ethnographers collecting folklore in the 1860s encountered the same pattern in oral traditions. Tribal groups across Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia preserved flood myths with disturbing consistency. The legends weren't vague creation stories, but detailed accounts of specific catastrophes that destroyed advanced civilizations. Turkic peoples told of ancestors who lived in great stone cities before the waters came. The stories described towers reaching skyward, markets filled with exotic goods, and rulers who measured time by the stars. Divine punishment for human arrogance brought floods that drowned the cities and scattered the survivors. The specificity suggested historical memory rather than mythological invention. Mongolic flood legends contained architectural details that matched Bronze Age settlement patterns. The stories described circular cities with concentric walls, exactly like Archaeum and related sites. They mentioned bronze gates, underground storage chambers, and defensive towers positioned for overlapping fields of fire. These weren't generic fantasy details, but technical descriptions of actual construction techniques. Tungusic traditions added chronological information. Their flood myths specified the catastrophe occurred when the ancestors' ancestors were young, suggesting transmission through many generations. Some versions mention stars visible during the flood that astronomical calculations placed around 2200 BCE, matching the climate catastrophe that destroyed Bronze Age settlements. The geographic distribution of these myths defied conventional explanation. Tribes separated by 3,000 miles preserved nearly identical flood narratives. The consistency implied either impossible coordination across vast distances or inheritance from a shared cultural source. The Bronze Age civilization hypothesis provided the only logical explanation. Populations dispersing from a common origin carried the same foundational myths, Tibetan monastic libraries held texts that European scholars rarely accessed. Those few who examined these documents found references that destabilized accepted chronologies. The text described a vast northern empire called Zhangzhung, existing long before the rise of any known Chinese dynasty. The empire supposedly possessed knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering that allowed construction projects spanning enormous distances. The Tibetan sources provided specific technical details. They described methods for calculating solar and lunar eclipses, techniques for smelting different metal ores, and systems for measuring land area using astronomical observations. The knowledge level suggested sophisticated scientific understanding, not primitive superstition. More remarkably, the texts claim this knowledge came from the north, from peoples living beyond the Himalayas. Buddhist historical chronicles preserved in Nepal mention similar northern kingdoms. The accounts described cities built with stones fitted without mortar, using astronomical alignments for positioning major structures. The chronicles dated these kingdoms to periods predating the historical Buddha, placing them in the 2nd or 3rd millennium BCE. Mainstream scholarship dismissed such accounts as legendary embellishment. Russian folklorists working among Siberian peoples in the 1870s collected stories about the old people who possessed lost knowledge. The tales weren't abstract myths, but specific technical information transmitted through generations. Elders described metallurgical techniques their ancestors used, astronomical observations for predicting seasons, and construction methods for buildings that could withstand earthquakes. One Yakut storyteller in 1873 provided such precise astronomical data that the Russian collector, a trained surveyor, recognized it as legitimate stellar observations. The elder described how the old people calculated the year's length by tracking specific stars, achieving accuracy within hours of modern measurements. When asked how he knew this, the elder claimed direct transmission through his lineage from ancestors who lived in cities now buried under the taiga. The consistency across cultures became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Kazakhs, Mongols, Tuvans, Yakuts, Buryats, every group preserved technical knowledge they attributed to advanced ancestors. The specificity distinguished these accounts from generic ancestor worship. They weren't claiming descent from gods or mythological heroes, but from people who built cities, worked metal, and studied the stars. Linguistic paleontology revealed even deeper patterns. Scholars reconstructing Proto-Turkic vocabulary discovered the language originally contained words for urban features as basic terminology. Terms for street, market, city gate, and public square appeared as fundamental concepts rather than borrowings from sedentary neighbours. The linguistic evidence suggested Proto-Turkic speakers lived in cities before their language family diverged. Proto-Mongolic reconstruction showed similar patterns. The reconstructed vocabulary included terms for bronze, forge, water channel, and stone foundation. These weren't peripheral concepts, but core vocabulary appearing in the earliest reconstructible language stage. Mongolic speakers originally possessed urban and technological terminology as essential parts of their linguistic identity. The Orkhon inscriptions carved by the Göktürk Khaganate in the 8th century CE provided direct evidence of preserved knowledge. The texts described rulers who measured the heavens and ordered the earth, using astronomical observations for governance. The inscriptions referenced ancient customs and laws inherited from distant ancestors, suggesting institutional continuity across centuries. More revealing were the technical terms in the Orkhon texts. The inscriptions used specialized vocabulary for administrative functions, legal concepts, and organizational hierarchies that shouldn't exist in recently nomadic cultures. The terminology implied bureaucratic traditions extending far beyond the Göktürk period, inherited from earlier sources. Chinese historical records corroborated the linguistic evidence once scholars examined them systematically. Han Dynasty sources describe the Xiongnu as possessing scribes who keep records and officials who distribute ranks. Tang chronicles mention the Gökturks maintaining archives of bronze tablets, recording historical events and legal precedents. These weren't capabilities recently acquired from Chinese contact, but indigenous practices the northern peoples already possessed. Arab geographers from the Islamic Golden Age provided independent confirmation. Al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century, described encountering northern peoples who possessed astronomical knowledge rivaling Islamic science. His account mentioned observatories built on mountain peaks, where specialists tracked celestial movements and predicted eclipses. The geographers treated these northern peoples as equals in scientific knowledge, not as primitive barbarians. The flood myths contained another crucial detail that appeared across cultures. The stories consistently described survivors fleeing to mountains, where they preserved knowledge in protected locations until conditions improved. This narrative pattern matched the archaeological evidence of underground cities in mountain regions, built specifically to shelter populations through environmental catastrophe. Turkic legends specified that certain families were chosen to preserve specific knowledge types. Some lineages maintained metallurgical secrets, others astronomical understanding, still others architectural techniques. The specialization ensured comprehensive knowledge preservation even if individual families perished. The system suggested deliberate planning for civilizational continuity through crisis. Mongolic traditions described keeper clans who protected sacred knowledge through generations. These clans supposedly maintained oral traditions detailing construction methods, metalworking techniques, and calendrical systems. The role was hereditary, passing from parent to child with strict training requirements. Anthropologists dismissed such claims until they encountered tribal specialists who actually possessed the technical knowledge the legends described. A Buryat metalworker interviewed in 1881 demonstrated alloying techniques that astonished Russian metallurgists. He created bronze with precise tin ratios without modern measuring equipment, using methods he claimed came from his ancestors. The technique required understanding the relationship between color, temperature, and alloy composition, knowledge that shouldn't exist in oral tradition without written technical manuals. Kazakhs possessed similar specialized knowledge. Certain families maintained irrigation engineering techniques that Russian agricultural experts recognized as sophisticated. The methods included calculating water channel gradients, designing distribution systems for maximum efficiency, and predicting seasonal water availability. When questioned about the source, the specialists invariably claimed inheritance from distant ancestors who built the old cities. The linguistic and oral evidence converged on a single conclusion. A Bronze Age civilization had developed across the Eurasian steppes, achieving technological sophistication requiring specialized knowledge and institutional structures. Climate catastrophe destroyed the material infrastructure, but populations deliberately preserved crucial knowledge through oral transmission and specialized family lineages. The preservation system worked because it was designed specifically for that purpose. The civilization facing environmental collapse didn't simply abandon their knowledge. They created redundant preservation methods ensuring survival through fragmentation. Flood myths served as mnemonic devices, embedding technical information in memorable narratives. Specialized lineages provided depth, maintaining detailed knowledge even when broader populations lost it. Language itself became a preservation mechanism. Technical terminology embedded in fundamental vocabulary meant descendants would retain concepts even if they no longer practiced the associated skills. The words for bronze, fortress, and measurement persisted through millennia of nomadic adaptation, maintaining linguistic connections to urban and technological heritage. The system's effectiveness appeared in periodic resurgences. When environmental conditions improved or political circumstances allowed, populations could draw on preserved knowledge to recreate organizational structures and technical capabilities. The Scythians, Xiongnu, and Göktürks represented such moments, descendants of the Bronze Age civilization temporarily reunifying and reactivating inherited systems. The Mongol Empire was simply the last and largest resurgence. Genghis Khan unified populations who still preserved fragments of ancient knowledge through language, oral tradition, and specialized lineages. His organizational genius lay in recognizing and systematically collecting this distributed knowledge, assembling fragments into functional whole. The Mongol administrative system wasn't invented. It was remembered and reconstructed from inherited templates. The linguistic evidence proved what archaeology suggested, and oral tradition preserved. Central Asian peoples weren't primitive nomads who occasionally borrowed civilization from sedentary neighbors. They were descendants of a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization, carrying forward its knowledge through millennia of environmental and political upheaval, waiting for circumstances that would allow its full expression once again. The Soviet archaeologist dropped his surveying equipment and recalculated the measurements 3 times. Alexei Okladnikov had been mapping Scythian burial mounds across southern Siberia since 1962, documenting their positions for archaeological records. The pattern he discovered in 1968 violated every assumption about Bronze Age capabilities. The burial mounds aligned with astronomical precision across distances exceeding 500 kilometers. Major kurgans positioned along sightlines, tracking summer and winter solstices with accuracy requiring mathematical knowledge and coordinated surveying. The positioning couldn't result from coincidence. The probability calculations made randomness impossible. More troubling was the scale. Individual burial sites might align accidentally with celestial events, but this network incorporated dozens of monuments across vast territories. Someone had planned these placements deliberately, using astronomical observations and geodetic measurements. The organizational capacity implied centralized authority coordinating construction across regions that supposedly lacked political unity. Okladnikov expanded his survey northward into Mongolia. The pattern intensified. Stone circles dotted the landscape, their construction dating to at least 2000 BCE based on artifact associations. These weren't simple stone arrangements, but sophisticated astronomical observatories, their structure encoding calendrical calculations and stellar tracking systems. One site near Lake Baikal contained upright stones positioned to mark sunrise positions throughout the year. The alignment accuracy reached within half a degree, precision requiring decades of systematic observation and mathematical correction for Earth's axial precession. Bronze Age peoples supposedly lacked writing systems for recording such long-term observations, yet the physical evidence proved they possessed that capability. The Mongolian observatories functioned like 3-dimensional calendars. Standing at the central marker during specific dates, observers could track the sun's movement against horizon stones, determining seasonal timing with accuracy crucial for agriculture and long-distance coordination. The sites incorporated lunar observations as well, marking major and minor lunar standstills that occurred over 18-year cycles. Chinese astronomical records suddenly gained new context. Han Dynasty documents described northern barbarians predicting eclipses and planetary conjunctions with remarkable accuracy. Tang sources mention nomadic peoples correcting Chinese court astronomers about celestial events. These accounts had been dismissed as face-saving fabrications, but the archaeological evidence suggested they documented real astronomical expertise among steppe populations. A particularly sophisticated observatory emerged from excavations in Kazakhstan in 1974. The site combined solar and stellar observations in a single complex, using stone markers to track both seasonal changes and stellar precession. The construction required understanding that Earth's rotational axis shifts gradually over millennia, causing apparent movement of stars relative to the horizon. This knowledge supposedly didn't exist until Greek astronomers developed it centuries later. The precision demanded standardized measurement systems. Distances between markers had to be calculated exactly for alignments to function. Analysis of the Kazakhstani site revealed the builders used a consistent unit of measurement, approximately 83 centimeters, appearing repeatedly in intervals and marker spacing. The standardization implied institutional continuity and mathematical sophistication. Russian surveyors working on the Trans-Siberian Railway reported finding similar stone circles throughout their route. Most were destroyed during construction, but engineers documented their positions before demolition. The record showed observatory sites appearing every 100 to 200 kilometers along routes later used by trade caravans. The spacing suggested these served as navigation markers, allowing travelers to determine position by astronomical observation. The navigation hypothesis gained support from Turkic inscriptions carved on standing stones. The Orkan text contained references to stones that guide travelers by the stars, describing how ancient peoples used fixed markers for determining latitude during long journeys. The system required astronomical knowledge and cartographic understanding far beyond simple wayfinding. Scythian burial goods included artifacts that functioned as portable astronomical instruments. Golden plaques recovered from kurgans showed zodiacal symbols arranged in patterns matching actual stellar positions during specific time periods. The plaques weren't decorative, they were star charts, allowing users to determine dates by comparing physical markers with observed celestial positions. One plaque recovered in 1971 from a burial near the Black Sea depicted stellar positions precisely matching the sky configuration around 650 BCE. The accuracy exceeded anything Greek astronomers achieved until Hipparchus developed his star catalogue centuries later. More remarkably, the plaque incorporated corrections for precession, suggesting the creators understood this phenomenon and accounted for it in their observations. The astronomical knowledge served practical purposes beyond calendar keeping. Managing a vast empire across the steppes required precise timekeeping for coordinating military campaigns, organizing trade caravans, and scheduling administrative activities. Without astronomical observations providing universal time standards, maintaining control over vast distances became nearly impossible. Ancient Turkic calendar systems, reconstructed from later Islamic sources, showed sophistication rivaling contemporary Chinese and Persian systems. The Turks used a combined solar-lunar calendar, requiring complex calculations to maintain synchronization between lunar months and solar years. The mathematical knowledge necessary for such systems shouldn't exist in cultures conventional history portrayed as illiterate nomads. Arab astronomers from the Islamic Golden Age acknowledged learning from Turkic sources. Al-Biruni, writing in the 11th century, described obtaining astronomical tables from the ancient Turks that contained observations predating Islamic science by centuries. He specifically mentioned stellar position data showing precession corrections, confirming the observations originated from long-term systematic programs. The observatories revealed another crucial function. They served as training centers. Analysis of artifact distributions around Mongolian stone circles showed evidence of sustained occupation by small groups. These weren't sites used occasionally for ceremonies, but permanent installations where specialists maintained astronomical knowledge through continuous observation and calculation. Petroglyphs near observatory sites depicted astronomical phenomena in ways demonstrating sophisticated understanding. One rock carving in the Altai Mountains showed the sun's apparent path across the sky at different seasons, with accurate representations of solstice and equinox positions. Another depicted lunar phases and eclipse sequences, recording observations over multiple decades. The most astonishing petroglyphs showed what appeared to be maps. Carvings depicted geographical features over hundreds of kilometers, positioned with accuracy suggesting aerial perspective or mathematical surveying. River systems, mountain ranges, and major settlements appeared in correct relative positions. Creating such maps without modern surveying equipment required trigonometric calculations and systematic data collection. One petroglyph map near Lake Balkhash showed an area covering approximately 50,000 square kilometers. The scale and orientation remained consistent throughout, implying the creators used standardized methods for converting ground measurements to representational images. The mathematical sophistication required for such cartography shouldn't exist without institutional support and specialized training. The maps contained another puzzling feature. They marked locations that archaeological surveys later confirmed as Bronze Age settlements. The petroglyphs predated the settlement's abandonment, suggesting they served as planning documents or administrative records for a civilization managing resources across vast territories. The organizational capacity implied by such mapping exceeded anything attributed to steppe peoples before the Mongol period. Chinese cartographic traditions acknowledged northern influence. Early Chinese maps incorporated geographical knowledge from beyond imperial borders, including detailed information about Central Asian geography. Some cartographic techniques, particularly methods for representing terrain using contour lines, appeared in Chinese sources after periods of northern contact, suggesting knowledge transfer from steppe peoples. The astronomical observatories connected to broader infrastructure networks. Stone markers aligned not only with celestial events, but also with distant geographical features, mountain peaks, river confluences, and passes through mountain ranges. The dual-purpose positioning allowed simultaneous astronomical observation and terrestrial surveying, integrating celestial and geographical knowledge into unified systems. Burial mound positions encoded this integration. Major kurgans marked both astronomically significant alignments and strategically important locations, water sources, defensive positions, and trade route intersections. The placement required understanding that combined cosmological beliefs with practical territorial management, suggesting sophisticated conceptual frameworks uniting different knowledge domains. The scale of coordination became clear when researchers mapped all known observatory sites. The network spanned from the Black Sea to Mongolia, covering over 5,000 kilometers. Maintaining such infrastructure required institutional continuity across centuries and political systems capable of organizing labor and resources across enormous distances. Climate data explained why these systems eventually failed. The severe droughts beginning around 2200 BCE disrupted the agricultural surplus necessary for supporting specialist astronomer priests. As settlements collapsed, the institutions maintaining astronomical knowledge fragmented. Observatories continued functioning where local populations survived, but the network's integrated nature broke down. Yet the knowledge didn't disappear entirely. Oral traditions preserved astronomical information through generations of environmental hardship. Specialized lineages maintained observation techniques even when larger institutional structures collapsed. The knowledge became concentrated rather than universal, held by fewer people but transmitted with remarkable fidelity. Evidence of this preservation appeared in later periods. Scythian astronomical capabilities in the first millennium BCE represented recovery rather than new development. They inherited techniques from Bronze Age predecessors, maintaining them through the environmental catastrophe that destroyed urban civilization. The golden plaques with astronomical data weren't Scythian innovations, but preserved copies of much older knowledge. The Mongols demonstrated similar inheritance. Genghis Khan's armies moved with precise coordination across vast distances, suggesting sophisticated timekeeping and positioning systems. Historical sources describe Mongol generals using astronomical observations for navigation and coordination. The capabilities emerged too rapidly to represent new learning. They drew on inherited knowledge that circumstances finally allowed to flourish again. The astronomical evidence proved what linguistics and archaeology suggested. Bronze Age Central Asian civilization possessed scientific knowledge rivaling contemporary civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China. The observatories, maps, and astronomical instruments weren't isolated achievements, but components of integrated systems for understanding and controlling space and time across continental distances. The builders of these observatories understood their sky with precision. Modern astronomers would recognize as legitimate science. They tracked celestial mechanics, corrected for precession, and developed mathematical systems for prediction and calculation. This knowledge didn't emerge from nothing when circumstances improved. It persisted through millennia of hardship, maintained by specialists who preserved their ancestors' scientific heritage against every catastrophe history could inflict. The geneticists stared at the DNA sequences and questioned 15 years of academic training. Dr. Elena Balanovska had been analysing Central Asian population genetics since 1998, mapping genetic markers across ethnic groups for medical research. The patterns emerging from her 2007 study contradicted every migration model conventional history proposed. Populations separated by 3,000 kilometres shared genetic signatures suggesting common ancestry, far predating known historical contacts. The markers weren't recent admixture from Mongol conquests or Silk Road trade, but ancient lineages dating back 4,000 years. Kazakhs, Mongols and Turkic groups from Anatolia carried identical Y chromosome haplogroups at frequencies impossible without sustained historical connection. More troubling were the dates. Molecular clock analysis placed the common ancestry around 2000 BCE, exactly coinciding with the Bronze Age settlement collapse. The genetic divergence patterns matched what would occur if a large unified population suddenly fragmented into isolated groups. Each group carried forward the genetic diversity of the original population, but isolation prevented further mixing. The data suggested massive population movements during the Bronze Age that conventional archaeology barely acknowledged. Genetic markers appeared simultaneously across vast territories, from the Carpathian Mountains to the Mongolian Plateau. The distribution pattern required coordinated migration or maintained contact across continental distances, not the isolated tribal wanderings that dominated historical narratives. Mitochondrial DNA analysis revealed even stranger patterns. Maternal lineages showed mixing between Eastern and Western Eurasian populations occurring primarily during the Bronze Age period. The admixture wasn't gradual accumulation from multiple contact episodes, but concentrated in a specific temporal window. Something during that period allowed or encouraged population movements and intermarriage across distances that later periods couldn't match. The Tarim Basin mummies provided physical evidence supporting the genetic data. Bodies preserved in Western China's desert climate showed European features: light hair, high-bridged noses, tall stature. Carbon dating placed them between 2000 and 1500 BCE, contemporary with the Bronze Age settlements in Kazakhstan. Their DNA revealed exactly the Eastern-Western admixture the genetic studies predicted. The mummies wore sophisticated textiles showing advanced weaving techniques. Tartan patterns appeared in their clothing, indicating complex loom technology and design traditions. The textiles weren't crude survival necessities, but refined cultural products requiring specialized craft knowledge and aesthetic sophistication. The quality matched contemporary textiles from the Mediterranean and Near East. Grave goods buried with the mummies included wooden artifacts with carved decorations, metal tools showing advanced metallurgy, and woven baskets of remarkable construction. The material culture implied settled populations with craft specialization, not mobile pastoralists carrying minimal possessions. The contradiction between their location in remote desert regions and their sophisticated material culture demanded explanation. Genetic analysis of the Tarim mummies showed they belonged to populations that had occupied Central Asia for thousands of years. They weren't recent migrants from the West, but descendants of populations established in the region since the Neolithic. Their European physical features resulted from ancient population movements that predated historical records by millennia. Chinese historical sources suddenly made sense. Han Dynasty texts described northern peoples as having red hair and green eyes, physical characteristics suggesting significant Western Eurasian ancestry. Tang chronicles mentioned similar descriptions. These weren't mythological embellishments, but accurate observations of populations whose genetic heritage included substantial Western components. The Tartarians presented another genetic puzzle. They spoke Indo-European languages in what is now Western China until the first millennium CE, their texts preserved in monastery libraries. Genetic studies of skeletal remains from Tartarian sites showed continuity with the earlier Tarim Basin populations. The linguistic and genetic evidence converged. Indo-European speakers had been in Central Asia for at least 3,000 years. Tartarian languages preserved technological vocabulary, suggesting their speakers originally possessed urban and agricultural traditions. Words for wheel, plough, fortress, and bronze appeared as ancient roots rather than borrowings. The linguistic evidence matched the genetic pattern. These populations descended from Bronze Age settlers who maintained cultural and linguistic identity through millennia. Ancient DNA from Scythian burials revealed populations with mixed ancestry, similar to the Tarim mummies. The genetic profile showed both Eastern and Western Eurasian components in roughly equal proportions. The admixture wasn't recent but dated to the Bronze Age, confirming these populations resulted from ancient mixing events rather than later historical contacts. Scythian burial practices suggested they understood kinship networks across vast distances. Grave goods included items from regions thousands of kilometers apart. Amber from the Baltic, silk from China, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The exotic materials appeared not as rare trade items but as regular burial inclusions, suggesting maintained contact with distant populations. Genetic analysis showed the trade networks corresponded to kinship networks. Populations along Scythian trade routes shared genetic markers at higher frequencies than their geographic proximity alone would predict. The pattern suggested deliberate marriage alliances maintaining connections across the trade network, using kinship ties to facilitate commerce and political coordination. The genetic data revealed population movements that archaeology struggled to detect. Major migrations occurred during the Late Bronze Age as climate deterioration forced populations to relocate. The movements weren't random dispersals but organized relocations following specific routes and settling in predetermined locations. The coordination implied institutional planning and maintained communication across migrating groups. Y chromosome haplogroup distributions showed patrilineal descent groups, spreading across enormous distances during this period. The same lineages appeared in populations from Hungary to Mongolia, suggesting male-line kinship groups maintaining identity through migration spanning thousands of kilometers. The preservation of lineage identity required social institutions that survived environmental catastrophe and sustained displacement. Autosomal DNA analysis revealed something even more remarkable. The genetic diversity within Central Asian populations exceeded diversity in more sedentary agricultural populations. High genetic diversity typically results from large population sizes and extensive mixing. The pattern suggested Bronze Age Central Asian populations numbered in the millions, not the thousands conventional estimates proposed. Population genetic modelling indicated Central Asia supported between 3 and 5 million people during the Bronze Age optimum climate period. This population density required agricultural surplus and urban infrastructure to maintain. The genetic evidence supported archaeological findings of extensive settlements and sophisticated resource management systems. The genetic bottleneck around 2200 BCE showed dramatic population decline. Diversity measurements dropped sharply, indicating population crashes reducing numbers by as much as 90%. The severity matched what climate models predicted from the drought catastrophe. But crucially, some lineages survived intact, preserving the genetic diversity that would later re-expand. Survivor populations concentrated in specific refugia, mountain valleys with reliable water sources, regions less affected by drought, and coastal areas. Genetic analysis showed these refugia maintained higher diversity than surrounding regions, suggesting they sheltered larger populations through the catastrophe. The underground cities in the Altai Mountains occupied exactly such refugia locations. The genetic preservation of diversity through the bottleneck wasn't random chance. Populations deliberately concentrated in protected locations, bringing together people from different regions to maintain maximum genetic and cultural variety. The strategy required coordinated planning and institutional capacity to organize large-scale population movements. Evidence appeared in founder effect analysis. When small populations establish in new locations, they typically show reduced genetic diversity reflecting the limited number of founders. Central Asian refugia populations showed the opposite. They maintained diversity levels approaching the pre-catastrophe population. The pattern indicated hundreds or thousands of people concentrating in each refugium, not small family groups seeking isolated survival. The genetic data explained periodic resurgences of steppe power. When climate conditions improved, refugia populations expanded outward, carrying forward the genetic and cultural diversity preserved during the catastrophe. The expansions followed previous settlement patterns, reoccupying locations their ancestors had abandoned centuries or millennia earlier. Scythian genetic profiles matched Bronze Age populations from the same regions, showing direct descent rather than population replacement. The Scythians weren't new arrivals but descendants of the Bronze Age civilization, re-expanding from refugia when conditions permitted. Their sophisticated culture resulted from maintaining Bronze Age knowledge through the environmental crisis. The Xiongnu showed similar genetic continuity. DNA analysis of Xiongnu burials revealed ancestry matching earlier Central Asian populations, not migrations from external regions. Chinese sources describing Xiongnu sophistication and organizational capacity made sense in this context. They represented another resurgence of preserved Bronze Age capabilities. Genetic studies of Mongolic-speaking populations revealed they too descended primarily from Bronze Age Central Asian populations rather than representing new ethnic groups. The Mongols inherited both genetic and cultural legacy from the ancient steppe civilization. Genghis Khan unified populations that shared common ancestry, stretching back thousands of years. The genetic evidence proved the Bronze Age civilization hadn't been replaced or eliminated by later populations. It had survived through fragmentation and adaptation, its descendants maintaining genetic identity through millennia of environmental and political upheaval. Every major steppe confederation represented the same populations reorganizing, drawing on shared ancestry and inherited knowledge. Modern Central Asian populations still carry genetic signatures from the Bronze Age. Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Mongols, and numerous smaller groups share ancestry traceable to the same ancient sources. The genetic unity underlying cultural and linguistic diversity reveals truth. Conventional history obscured. Central Asia was inhabited by populations maintaining remarkable continuity across 4,000 years. The implications transformed understanding of human population history. Central Asia wasn't a peripheral region where external civilizations occasionally intruded. It was a demographic core, supporting millions of people who developed sophisticated culture and maintained genetic continuity through environmental catastrophes that destroyed contemporary civilizations elsewhere. The genetic data revealed what the mummies physically demonstrated, what linguistics suggested, and what archaeology discovered. The Bronze Age steppe civilization comprised diverse but interconnected populations spanning continental distances. Their descendants survived its collapse, preserving not just cultural knowledge but the very genetic diversity of their ancestors. The populations that periodically erupted from the steppes to reshape world history weren't barbarian invaders, but the inheritors of an ancient and sophisticated legacy written in their very DNA. The ice core told a story of devastation that matched no living memory. French glaciologist Claude Lorius extracted the sample from Greenland in 1984, expecting routine climate data. What the isotope analysis revealed transformed understanding of Bronze Age history across 3 continents. Oxygen isotope ratios showed extreme drought conditions beginning around 2200 BCE and persisting for 3 centuries. Precipitation across the northern hemisphere dropped by 30 to 40% during this period. The climate shift wasn't gradual adaptation, but catastrophic collapse, transforming fertile grasslands into desert within a single generation. Central Asia suffered the worst effects. Paleoclimatic reconstruction showed lake levels dropping by 20 meters in less than 50 years. Rivers that had flowed year-round became seasonal or vanished entirely. Archaeological evidence confirmed the devastation. Settlements occupied for centuries were suddenly abandoned, their inhabitants vanishing from the archaeological record. The timing coincided precisely with civilization collapses across the ancient world. Egypt's Old Kingdom fell around 2200 BCE, ending the pyramid-building era in chaos and fragmentation. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia collapsed simultaneously, its cities abandoned as agricultural collapse triggered famine and social breakdown. The Indus Valley civilization began its terminal decline during the same period, but those civilizations left clear evidence of their collapse. Texts describing drought and famine, skeletal remains showing malnutrition, and sequential layers of abandonment in archaeological sites. The Central Asian collapse seemed more complete, as if the civilization simply vanished. The difference lay in preservation conditions and later historical attention, not in the severity of the catastrophe. Sediment cores from Central Asian lakes revealed the environmental transformation. Pollen analysis showed dramatic vegetation changes occurring within decades. Tree species requiring regular rainfall disappeared, replaced by drought-resistant shrubs and grasses. Agricultural crops vanished from the pollen record almost entirely, suggesting complete agricultural collapse. The drought's effects cascaded through interconnected systems. Crop failures eliminated food surpluses supporting urban populations. Cities dependent on agricultural hinterlands lost their economic foundations. Craft specialists, administrators, and religious institutions collapsed as the tax base supporting them disappeared. Trade networks broke down as production ceased and population scattered. Archaeological evidence showed the collapse sequence. Settlements in the most drought-affected regions were abandoned first, around 2150 BCE. Populations concentrated in areas with more reliable water sources, creating temporary refuge settlements. These secondary sites showed evidence of overcrowding and resource stress, malnourished skeletal remains, reduced artifact quality, and minimal construction of permanent structures. The Bronze Age settlements in Kazakhstan showed clear abandonment layers. Occupation debris ended abruptly, with no gradual decline or transitional period. Valuables were left behind, suggesting populations fled rapidly rather than conducting orderly evacuations. The pattern indicated crisis conditions overwhelming organized response. Some centers persisted longer than others, becoming final refuges for surrounding populations. Archaeum and similar fortified settlements showed evidence of sustained occupation through the early catastrophe period. Their defensive walls were reinforced, granaries expanded, and water management systems modified to maximize efficiency. The modifications demonstrated populations adapting to deteriorating conditions through technological responses. But even these fortified centers eventually failed. Occupation at Archaeum ended around 1800 BCE, after nearly 4 centuries of environmental stress. The final layers showed minimal artifact deposition and poor quality construction, suggesting reduced populations maintaining only essential functions. The inhabitants didn't die in place. The site was deliberately abandoned, with no evidence of violent destruction or mass casualty events. Climate models explain the staged collapse. The drought wasn't uniformly severe across all regions, but varied by local geography. Mountain valleys with glacial meltwater sources maintained water supplies longer than open steppe regions. Populations concentrated in these favourable locations, creating refugia where civilization could persist despite broader environmental catastrophe. The underground cities in the Altai Mountains served exactly this function. Their construction predated the climate catastrophe, suggesting Bronze Age populations built them specifically as emergency shelters. The sophisticated ventilation systems, water management and storage capacity indicated planning for long-term occupation by large populations. These weren't improvised survival shelters but engineered refugia designed to preserve civilization through predicted environmental crisis. Evidence of deliberate knowledge preservation appeared in the refugia sites. Storage chambers contained metallurgical tools, astronomical instruments, and what appeared to be archive spaces for preserving records. The selection of items stored suggested priorities, preserving technical knowledge and productive capabilities rather than simply hoarding wealth or food supplies. The catastrophe forced complete economic transformation. Agricultural surplus supporting specialized craftsmen and administrators disappeared. Populations had to become self-sufficient, forcing abandonment of craft specialization and institutional complexity. The transformation from urban civilization to mobile pastoralism wasn't cultural choice, but environmental necessity. Yet mobile pastoralism proved remarkably adaptive. Herding animals across vast distances allowed populations to survive in newly arid environments. The strategy required different knowledge, understanding seasonal grazing patterns, water source locations, and animal husbandry techniques. But populations possessed this knowledge already, inherited from the mixed economy their civilization had always maintained. The Bronze Age settlements had never been purely urban. Archaeological evidence showed they maintained herds alongside agriculture, combining sedentary farming with mobile pastoralism. When climate change eliminated agriculture, populations could fall back on the pastoral component they'd never abandoned. The transition was traumatic but not impossible. Genetic bottleneck analysis revealed the catastrophe's demographic impact. Population genetic studies showed Central Asian populations declined by 80 to 90% between 2200 and 1800 BCE. The survivors concentrated in refugia represented a tiny fraction of the original civilization's population. The genetic diversity they preserved proved they deliberately gathered from multiple source populations. Climate data showed brief recovery periods during the centuries of overall drought. Lake levels occasionally rose, rainfall temporarily increased, and vegetation partially recovered. Populations attempted to reoccupy abandoned settlements during these favourable intervals. Archaeological evidence of reoccupation layers dating to 2000 and 1850 BCE shows populations hadn't forgotten their urban heritage. But the recovery periods never lasted. Drought conditions returned, forcing renewed abandonments. The repeated cycle of hope and failure had profound psychological impacts, eventually convincing populations that permanent urban settlement had become impossible. Cultural memory shifted from city building to survival through mobility and adaptation. The transformation preserved crucial elements despite superficial changes. Metallurgical knowledge persisted because metalworking remained valuable even for mobile populations. Astronomical understanding continued because navigating vast distances required celestial observation. Organizational hierarchies survived because coordinating large groups required leadership structures regardless of settlement patterns. Language preserved what material culture simplified. Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic languages retained vocabulary for urban features, administrative concepts, and technological processes their speakers no longer practiced. The words maintained conceptual continuity, ensuring populations could reconstruct lost capabilities if circumstances improved. Oral traditions embedded technical knowledge in narrative structures designed for long-term preservation. Flood myths weren't just stories, but mnemonic devices encoding information about construction techniques, metallurgical processes, and astronomical observations. The narratives ensured knowledge transmission across generations who lacked the material resources to practice the skills being preserved. Sacred sites became knowledge repositories. Locations with astronomical observatories or unusual geological features were designated as teaching centers where specialists maintained technical traditions. Populations dispersed across vast territories for most of the year gathered periodically at these sites, allowing knowledge exchange and institutional continuity despite nomadic fragmentation. The system worked because it was deliberately designed. Bronze Age populations facing environmental catastrophe didn't simply collapse into chaos. They created redundant preservation mechanisms ensuring their civilization's core knowledge would survive even if material infrastructure couldn't. The planning revealed sophisticated understanding of how knowledge persists across societal transformations. Some refugia maintained higher organizational complexity than others. Sites with particularly reliable water sources could support larger populations and greater specialization. These became centers preserving institutional knowledge, administrative practices, legal traditions, and religious continuity. The centers served as cultural anchors maintaining civilizational identity through centuries of hardship. Archaeological evidence from these persistent centers showed modified but continuous occupation from Bronze Age through Iron Age. The settlements shrank dramatically but never completely disappeared. Material culture simplified but maintained connections to earlier traditions. The continuity proved that the Bronze Age civilization didn't end. It transformed, adapting to conditions that wouldn't support its original urban form. Climate conditions began improving around 1500 BCE, though never returning to Bronze Age optimal levels. populations started expanding from refugia, reoccupying territories their ancestors had abandoned centuries earlier. The expansion followed inherited geographic knowledge, re-establishing settlements in locations their oral traditions described as ancestral homes. The Scythians emerged from this post-catastrophe expansion. Their sophisticated culture reflected not new development, but recovery of Bronze Age capabilities. The astronomical knowledge, metallurgical expertise, and organizational structures weren't recently acquired, but inherited from ancestors who had maintained them through 5 centuries of environmental crisis. The catastrophe's legacy shaped Central Asian history for millennia afterward. Populations never forgot that cities could fail, that environmental conditions could destroy even sophisticated civilizations. The memory created cultural conservatism, reluctance to commit fully to sedentary urbanism when mobile pastoralism offered proven resilience. The psychological impact of the Bronze Age collapse persisted through dozens of generations. Yet the collapse also demonstrated civilizational resilience. Despite losing 90% of their population and abandoning urban infrastructure, Central Asian peoples preserved enough knowledge to eventually reconstruct sophisticated culture. The preservation mechanisms they created, linguistic continuity, oral tradition, sacred site knowledge repositories, proved more durable than stone buildings or written archives. The climate catastrophe around 2200 BCE destroyed the Bronze Age steppe civilization's material manifestation but strengthened its cultural foundations. The survivors learned that knowledge mattered more than infrastructure, that human capital outlasted physical capital, and that civilization existed in minds and traditions rather than just buildings and institutions. These lessons shaped how their descendants approached empire building, when circumstances finally allowed another attempt at continental unity. The Persian chronicler watched Mongol administrators organize a census of conquered territories and recognize something impossible. Atamalik Juvaini served the Mongol Empire from 1256, documenting its administrative systems for his historical chronicle. The sophistication he observed in 1260 contradicted everything he knew about recently unified nomadic confederations. The Mongols possessed decimal military organization that appeared fully formed the moment Genghis Khan unified the tribes in 1206. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 functioned with precision, requiring years of institutional development. Yet conventional history claimed the Mongols had no such organizational tradition before Genghis. The system emerged too rapidly to represent new invention. Postal relay networks spanned the empire within decades of its founding. The yam system allowed messages to travel thousands of miles in weeks, using stations positioned at precise intervals with fresh horses and riders. Building such infrastructure required surveying knowledge, geographic understanding, and organizational capacity that supposedly didn't exist among steppe nomads. But the stations weren't built from nothing. Archaeological surveys of yam system routes revealed they followed Bronze Age pathways, reusing road foundations and positioning stations near ancient settlement sites. The Mongols reactivated existing infrastructure rather than creating new networks. The speed of imperial expansion reflected rediscovery of ancient routes their ancestors had once travelled. Administrative documents from the early Mongol Empire showed bureaucratic sophistication emerging suspiciously fast. Tax collection systems, population registers, and legal codes appeared within years of conquest, implemented with uniformity across vast territories. The administrative apparatus seemed to spring fully formed from populations that supposedly lacked literacy or governmental experience. Genghis Khan actively recruited specialists possessing ancient knowledge. Historical sources describe him seeking out shamans, elderly advisors, and keepers of oral traditions during his rise to power. These specialists didn't teach him Chinese or Persian administrative methods. They shared knowledge inherited from Mongol ancestors, organizational models predating recorded history. The shamanic traditions preserved institutional memory that written records couldn't match. Shamans transmitted knowledge through apprenticeship systems, maintaining fidelity across generations. Their knowledge included not just spiritual practices but practical information, astronomical observations, geographic data, and administrative procedures inherited from the Bronze Age civilization. Chinese sources noted that Genghis Khan's most trusted advisors included shamans who claimed descent from ancient lineages. These advisors provided organizational frameworks that the Khan adapted for his conquests. The frameworks weren't invented but recovered, drawn from oral traditions preserving Bronze Age governmental structures. The speed of Mongol expansion becomes less miraculous when understood as network reactivation. The empire didn't conquer unknown territories but reunified lands that shared common cultural heritage. Populations across the steppes recognized Mongol organizational systems because those systems resembled their own ancestral traditions. Resistance decreased when conquered peoples saw the Mongols as restoring rather than imposing foreign rule. Mongol capitals incorporated older ruins systematically. Karakoram, built as the imperial capital, stood in a region dense with Bronze Age settlements and monuments. Archaeological evidence showed Mongol builders deliberately positioning new structures to align with ancient foundations. The practice suggested reverence for ancestral sites and desire to connect their empire with earlier civilizations. The Mongol legal code, the Yasa, contained elements that predated Genghis Khan's innovations. Comparative analysis with later Turkic and Mongolic legal traditions revealed shared concepts and procedures. The similarities suggested common inheritance from ancient legal systems rather than independent invention. Genghis codified existing traditions more than creating new law. Military tactics showed similar inheritance. The Mongols employed sophisticated siege warfare techniques immediately upon encountering fortified cities. They understood lever systems for siege engines, geometric principles for undermining walls, and logistical calculations for sustaining armies during extended sieges. This knowledge couldn't emerge spontaneously. It required engineering traditions passed through generations. Chinese engineers recruited by the Mongols reported that their captors already understood basic siege principles. The Mongols needed technical assistance with specific Chinese defensive innovations, but possessed foundational knowledge of fortification and siegecraft. The baseline understanding suggested inheritance from ancestors who had built and besieged cities during the Bronze Age. Astronomical knowledge aided Mongol military coordination. Generals used celestial observations for timekeeping and navigation, allowing synchronized campaigns across vast distances. Historical sources describe Mongol commanders predicting weather patterns and seasonal changes with accuracy that impressed Chinese scholars. The capabilities reflected inherited astronomical traditions rather than recent learning. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the empire fragmented within decades. His descendants ruled different sections: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Each successor state adapted to local conditions, adopting Persian, Chinese, and Russian cultural elements. The fragmentation triggered deliberate cultural amnesia. Mongol rulers in China became increasingly Chinese, adopting Confucian administrative practices and downplaying their steppe heritage. The Ilkhans converted to Islam and embraced Persian cultural identity. The Golden Horde intermarried with Turkic populations and gradually lost distinct Mongol characteristics. The transformation served political purposes. Local populations accepted rulers who adopted local customs more readily than foreign conquerors. European cartographers continued marking Tartary on their maps for centuries after the Mongol Empire's fragmentation. The name persisted from the 1300s through the 1700s, covering territories controlled by various successor states. But knowledge about what Tartary actually represented became increasingly vague. By the 18th century, the term had become a catch-all label for unknown Central Asian regions. Some historians argue the vagueness wasn't accidental. Successor states actively obscured connections to older traditions as they integrated into Chinese, Persian, and Russian cultural spheres. Acknowledging descent from a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization complicated narratives of civilizing barbaric nomads. Both conquerors and conquered benefited from forgetting the steppes' urban past. Russian expansion into Siberia encountered evidence of ancient civilization, but interpreted it through colonial frameworks. Explorers finding ruins attributed them to mysterious lost peoples, rather than ancestors of current inhabitants. The interpretation served Russian imperial ideology, portraying indigenous peoples as primitive justified conquest as a civilizing mission. Chinese historical scholarship similarly marginalized steppe cultural achievements. Conventional histories portrayed northern peoples as barbaric threats requiring Chinese military and cultural superiority to contain. Acknowledging northern peoples as inheritors of sophisticated civilization challenged fundamental narratives of Chinese cultural supremacy. The deliberate forgetting extended to indigenous populations themselves. Kazakhs, Mongols, and other Central Asian peoples absorbed narratives from Russian and Chinese sources, portraying their ancestors as primitive nomads. Urban heritage became associated with external civilizations, Greeks, Persians, Chinese, rather than indigenous development. The cultural amnesia served political stability by reducing resistance to colonial rule. Yet oral traditions preserved what official histories obscured. 20th century ethnographers collecting folklore encountered consistent accounts of ancestral civilizations among elderly informants. The stories described cities, advanced technologies, and organizational sophistication matching archaeological evidence. But these accounts remained marginalized as folk mythology rather than historical memory. The name Tartary itself became object of speculation and conspiracy theories. Some writers claimed it represented a suppressed advanced civilization deliberately erased from history. While the conspiracy theories lacked evidence, they reflected genuine historical puzzles. Why did the name persist so long on maps while becoming increasingly disconnected from actual geography or political entities? The answer lay in cartographic conservatism and genuine European ignorance. Mapmakers copied terms from earlier maps without direct knowledge of regions they depicted. Tartary persisted because European scholars lacked reliable information about Central Asian political divisions. The term's vagueness reflected real historical conditions. The region's political fragmentation and limited European access created genuine knowledge gaps. But the vagueness also served deliberate purposes. Russian authorities restricted European access to Central Asian regions, they claimed, preventing independent verification of geographic and ethnographic information. Chinese authorities similarly limited foreign travel in border regions. The restrictions maintained colonial control by preventing subject populations from forming international connections or receiving external support. Archaeological evidence contradicting primitivist narratives was systematically downplayed. Russian excavations uncovered sophisticated ancient sites throughout Siberia and Central Asia, but interpreted them as anomalies or attributed them to external influences. The pattern repeated across colonial powers. Findings challenging narratives of indigenous backwardness received minimal scholarly attention or publication. Soviet archaeology partially reversed this pattern. Marxist ideology encouraged emphasizing indigenous development and material achievements of non-European peoples. Soviet archaeologists conducted extensive surveys uncovering Bronze Age settlements, metallurgical sites, and astronomical observatories. Their findings demonstrated Central Asian civilization sophistication, but remained isolated in Russian-language publications with limited international distribution. The Cold War created additional barriers to knowledge synthesis. Western scholars couldn't access Soviet archaeological findings, while Soviet researchers lacked access to Western genetic and linguistic studies. The political division prevented comprehensive analysis combining different evidence types into unified historical narrative. Post-Soviet opening of archives and international collaboration finally enabled synthesis. Genetic studies could be compared with archaeological findings, linguistic analysis could incorporate oral traditions, and astronomical evidence could be integrated with historical sources. The comprehensive approach revealed patterns individual disciplines had missed. The Mongol Empire represented the last attempt to reunify the ancient Bronze Age territories under single authority. Genghis Khan's genius lay in recognizing and systematically recovering knowledge fragments dispersed across populations. He collected specialists, gathered oral traditions, and reactivated ancient systems that centuries of fragmentation had obscured but not eliminated. The empire's rapid collapse after brief florescence mirrored the Bronze Age pattern. Environmental conditions, political fragmentation, and cultural adaptation to external powers prevented sustained reunification. But the attempt proved that knowledge persisted, that organizational templates survived, and that populations maintained cultural memory of their shared heritage despite millennia of separation. The deliberate amnesia that followed served multiple political purposes, but couldn't erase the evidence completely. Archaeological sites remained beneath the soil, oral traditions persisted in remote communities, and genetic markers preserved in DNA told stories written records tried to obscure. The truth survived in fragments, waiting for scholars willing to challenge conventional narratives and synthesize evidence across disciplines. The Mongol inheritance proved that the Bronze Age steppe civilization's collapse wasn't final extinction, but transformation. Its knowledge persisted through shamanic traditions, its organizational structure survived in oral memory, and its cultural identity maintained continuity through genetic descent. The periodic resurgences throughout history represented the same civilization repeatedly attempting to restore itself, each time adapting to current conditions while drawing on ancient foundations that never completely disappeared. The Russian surveyor's report gathered dust in the Imperial Geographic Society archives for 70 years before anyone examined it closely. Pyotr Chikachev had explored southern Siberia in 1842, documenting extensive ruins that conventional scholarship couldn't explain. His detailed measurements and sketches showed stone foundations covering hundreds of hectares, positioned in regions supposedly inhabited only by scattered nomadic groups. The foundations showed construction techniques matching neither Russian nor Chinese methods. Stone blocks fit together without mortar, their surfaces dressed with precision requiring metal tools and mathematical understanding. The positioning followed geometric patterns, rectangular grids, circular arrangements, and alignments with cardinal directions. Chikachev estimated some structures predated Russian expansion by at least 1,000 years. His report included descriptions of metallurgical sites scattered across the landscape, slag heaps extended for acres, residue from extensive bronze and iron production. The volume suggested industrial-scale operations sustained over centuries. Chemical analysis of slag samples showed alloy compositions requiring sophisticated metallurgical knowledge and temperature control. The Imperial Geographic Society filed the report without publication. Colonial narratives portrayed Siberian indigenous peoples as primitive, justifying Russian expansion as civilizing mission. Evidence of sophisticated indigenous civilization complicated these narratives. The report remained archived, consulted occasionally by specialists but never integrated into mainstream historical understanding. Soviet archaeologists rediscovered similar evidence throughout the 20th century. Expeditions in Kazakhstan during the 1950s uncovered irrigation networks extending hundreds of kilometers. The channels showed precise gradient calculations, maintaining flow rates, preventing both stagnation and erosion. Engineering analysis confirmed the systems required surveying instruments and mathematical knowledge. The irrigation networks dated to Bronze Age periods, contemporary with similar systems in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. Yet scholarship on ancient hydraulic engineering rarely mentioned Central Asian examples. Textbooks discussing irrigation development focused on Near Eastern and South Asian civilizations, treating Central Asia as peripheral region receiving technology from elsewhere. The Bactria Margiana archaeological complex revealed a Bronze Age civilization in Central Asia, rivaling contemporary cultures elsewhere. Discovered in the 1970s by Soviet archaeologist Viktor Saryanidi, the sites showed urban planning, craft specialization, and long-distance trade. Fortified settlements housed thousands of people, their layout demonstrating sophisticated organizational capacity. Bactria Margiana contained distinctive artifacts, elaborate bronze vessels, carved stone containers, and metal weapons showing advanced metallurgy. The material culture matched contemporaneous civilizations in sophistication, but displayed unique artistic traditions. The civilization clearly developed independently, rather than simply importing culture from neighboring regions. Despite its significance, Bactria Margiana remained largely unknown outside specialist circles. Few general histories of Bronze Age civilizations mentioned it. Educational materials discussing ancient urban development focused on Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and the Indus Valley while ignoring Central Asian examples. The scholarly neglect reflected broader patterns marginalizing Central Asian achievements. Chinese archaeological work along the Silk Road uncovered cities predating Han Dynasty expansion westward. Settlements in the Tarim Basin showed indigenous urban development rather than Chinese cultural diffusion. The cities possessed distinctive architecture, local craft traditions, and evidence of literacy in scripts unrelated to Chinese writing systems. The discoveries challenged narratives of Chinese civilization spreading westward to enlighten barbaric peripheries. Indigenous Central Asian populations had developed urban culture independently, maintaining sophisticated societies before Chinese contact. The archaeological evidence required reconsidering East Asian history's conventional frameworks. Yet scholarly resistance to revision remained strong. Established narratives possessed institutional inertia, textbooks already written, academic careers built on conventional interpretations, and popular understanding shaped by generations of repetition. Challenging fundamental assumptions required overwhelming evidence, and individual discoveries could be dismissed as anomalies or misinterpretations. The Kazakhstan geoglyphs emerged from satellite imagery in 2007, revealing enormous earthworks visible only from above. The structures included squares, crosses, and geometric patterns extending hundreds of meters. Carbon dating placed construction between 800 BCE and 200 CE, though some formations might be significantly older. The geoglyphs required organizational capacity to coordinate labor across large populations. Creating earthworks of such scale demanded surveying knowledge, mathematical calculations, and social structures capable of mobilizing resources for non-subsistence projects. The sophistication challenged assumptions about nomadic Central Asian societies during this period. Archaeologists investigating the geoglyphs found associated settlements showing permanent occupation and craft specialization. The earthworks weren't isolated monuments, but components of larger settlement complexes. The discovery reinforced evidence that Central Asian nomads maintained mixed economies combining pastoralism with sedentary activities. Islamic Golden Age scholars had documented similar evidence centuries earlier. Al-Biruni, writing in the 11th century, described encountering ruins of ancient cities across Central Asia. He attributed them to pre-Islamic civilizations about which he possessed minimal information. Later scholars dismissed these accounts as confused references to Persian ruins or legendary embellishments. But Al-Biruni provided specific architectural descriptions and geographical locations. Modern archaeological surveys of sites he mentioned revealed actual ruins matching his accounts. The Islamic scholars weren't inventing or confusing. They documented last visible traces of Bronze Age civilization before weathering and vegetation obscured them completely. Persian historical texts contained references to ancient northern empires predating the Achaemenids. The Shahnameh and other sources described kingdoms in the steppes, possessing great wealth and military power. Mainstream scholarship treated these as mythological, but the archaeological evidence suggested they preserved distorted memories of actual Bronze Age polities. The pattern repeated across sources, textual references to ancient Central Asian civilization dismissed as mythology, archaeological evidence treated as anomalous, and alternative interpretations marginalized in academic discourse. The consistency of dismissal suggested systematic bias rather than objective evaluation of evidence. An alternative interpretation became unavoidable once evidence accumulated sufficiently. A Bronze Age civilization developed across the Eurasian steppe, achieving technological and organizational sophistication rivaling contemporary cultures elsewhere. The civilization possessed urban centers, specialized crafts, astronomical knowledge, and political structures coordinating populations across vast territories. Climate catastrophe around 2200 BCE triggered the civilization's collapse. Severe drought persisting for centuries forced agricultural abandonment and urban depopulation. The environmental crisis destroyed material infrastructure, while populations adapted through nomadic pastoralism. The transformation represented strategic response to change conditions rather than cultural regression. Successor populations maintained elements of Bronze Age civilization through knowledge preservation mechanisms. Oral traditions transmitted technical information across generations. Specialized lineages preserved specific skills, metallurgy, astronomy, administrative practices. Sacred sites functioned as institutional repositories, maintaining continuity despite material simplification. The periodic eruptions of steppe empires, Scythians, Xiongnu, Gökturks, Mongols, represented attempts at reunification by populations inheriting Bronze Age knowledge. Each confederation drew on preserved traditions, reactivating organizational systems and technical capabilities their ancestors had developed. The empires weren't spontaneous emergences but recoveries of ancient patterns. This interpretation explained anomalies conventional narratives struggled to address. How did primitive nomads suddenly develop sophisticated siege warfare techniques? They inherited them from ancestors who built and defended cities. Why did steppe languages contain urban and technological vocabulary? The words preserved memories of ancestors who possessed those capabilities. The genetic evidence supported alternative interpretation completely. Central Asian populations showed continuity from Bronze Age through modern periods, not population replacement. The same genetic lineages persisted through supposed transitions from urban civilization to nomadism and back. Cultural changes reflected adaptation rather than ethnic substitution. Linguistic patterns made sense under the alternative framework. Shared vocabulary across Turkic, Mongolic and Tungusic language families reflected common inheritance from Bronze Age proto-language rather than later borrowing. The technical terminology predated historical contacts between these groups, proving ancient common source. Archaeological evidence of technological continuity became clear once scholars looked for it. Metallurgical techniques showed consistent evolution from Bronze Age through later periods. Scythian metalworking built on Bronze Age foundations, incorporating innovations but maintaining core processes. The continuity proved knowledge transmission across supposed civilizational gaps. Yet academic acceptance remained limited. The alternative interpretation required abandoning frameworks, structuring decades of scholarship. Careers had been built on conventional narratives of Central Asian primitiveness and periodic external civilizing influences. Admitting fundamental error meant invalidating mountains of previous work. Political factors reinforced scholarly resistance. Nation-states built legitimacy on narratives portraying indigenous peoples as backward before conquest brought civilization. Russian, Chinese and Persian national histories depended on these frameworks. Acknowledging sophisticated indigenous Central Asian civilization undermined justifications for historical conquests and contemporary political arrangements. The suppression wasn't conspiracy, but structural bias. Funding priorities favoured research confirming established narratives. Publication in prestigious journals required fitting conventional frameworks. Academic advancement depended on avoiding controversial interpretations that challenged senior scholars' lifetime work. The system systematically discouraged paradigm challenges regardless of evidence quality. Independent researchers pursuing alternative interpretations faced marginalization. Their work appeared in specialized journals with limited readership, excluded from mainstream academic discourse. Popular histories ignored their findings, perpetuating conventional narratives in educational materials and public understanding. The institutional barriers prevented evidence synthesis that might force paradigm shifts. Yet the evidence accumulated regardless of academic resistance. Each new discovery, another Bronze Age settlement, additional genetic data, further linguistic analysis, reinforced the alternative interpretation. The weight of accumulated findings eventually would force reconsideration, though the process might require generational change as scholars committed to old frameworks retired. The truth emerged from synthesis across disciplines. Archaeology provided material evidence, genetics revealed population continuity, linguistics showed knowledge preservation, and climatology explained environmental pressures. Each discipline alone couldn't prove the alternative interpretation, but combined they formed overwhelming case. Central Asia wasn't peripheral backwater occasionally producing barbarian invaders. It was the site of a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that collapsed under environmental stress, its populations adapting through strategic transformation while preserving core knowledge. The periodic steppe empires represented this civilization's descendants, repeatedly attempting to restore ancestral glory, each time adapting to contemporary conditions while drawing on inherited foundations. The suppressed evidence proved that conventional narratives failed not from lack of data, but from unwillingness to question fundamental assumptions. The archaeological sites, genetic studies, and linguistic patterns had been available for decades. What prevented synthesis wasn't missing information, but conceptual frameworks that couldn't accommodate evidence contradicting established beliefs about Central Asian history and the nature of nomadic societies. The satellite image showed patterns that ground-level archaeology had missed for decades. NASA's Landsat program, mapping Earth's surface since 1972, captured Central Asian landscapes in wavelengths, revealing subsurface features invisible to human eyes. The 2015 analysis revealed a network of ancient roads connecting sites across 2,000 kilometers, their routes still visible as soil discoloration despite millennia of erosion. The road network followed optimal paths between Bronze Age settlements, avoiding difficult terrain while connecting major population centers. Modern highway engineers analyzing the routes confirmed they represented sophisticated planning, minimizing distance while accounting for topography and water sources. The infrastructure implied centralized coordination and sustained maintenance across continental distances. Ground-penetrating radar surveys confirmed the satellite findings. Teams working in Kazakhstan between 2016 and 2019 detected buried foundations following the ancient road network. The structures appeared at regular intervals, suggesting way station systems for travelers and trade caravans. Carbon dating of artifact scatters placed the road network's construction between 2500 and 2000 BCE. The evidence converged from multiple independent sources. Linguistics showed common ancestry and preserved technological vocabulary. Genetics revealed population continuity from Bronze Age through modern periods. Archaeology uncovered urban settlements, astronomical observatories, and sophisticated infrastructure. Climate science explained the catastrophic collapse. The pattern became undeniable once scholars examined evidence across disciplines. Each individual finding could be dismissed or explained away through alternative hypotheses. But the accumulated weight overwhelmed skepticism. The linguistic connections couldn't result from coincidence across 3 language families. The genetic continuity couldn't reflect population replacement when DNA showed direct descent. The archaeological sophistication couldn't represent external influence when it predated contact with supposed source civilizations. The conventional narrative strained under scrutiny, claiming Eurasian steppes were inhabited solely by primitive nomads, required ignoring vast archaeological evidence. Attributing periodic steppe empire sophistication to sudden genius or external borrowing couldn't explain the consistent patterns across millennia. The old framework failed to accommodate evidence it was designed to interpret. A more parsimonious explanation acknowledged Bronze Age Central Asian civilization, achieving sophistication rivaling contemporary cultures. Climate catastrophe triggered collapse but not extinction. Populations adapted through strategic transformation, preserving knowledge while simplifying material culture. Periodic resurgences represented descendants recovering ancestral capabilities when circumstances permitted. This framework explained anomalies conventional histories struggled with. Scythian technological sophistication resulted from inheritance, not spontaneous development. Xiongnu organizational capacity drew on preserved administrative traditions. Göktürk astronomical knowledge came from maintained observation programs spanning centuries. Mongol Empire administrative systems reactivated ancient templates, rather than inventing new structures. The name Tartary preserved memory of this older identity. European cartographers encountered populations who remembered belonging to something larger than their current political divisions. The term predated specific ethnic designations, pointing towards shared cultural heritage underlying tribal fragmentation. Mapmakers applied it to regions they didn't understand, unwittingly preserving reference to Bronze Age civilization. Modern Central Asian archaeology continued yielding surprises. Excavations in Uzbekistan during 2018 uncovered a Bronze Age settlement with evidence of writing. The script remained undeciphered, but its presence proved literacy existed among steppe populations millennia before conventional timelines proposed. The discovery challenged fundamental assumptions about Central Asian cultural development. Each decade brought findings pushing timelines backward and revealing greater complexity. Bronze Age settlements appeared larger, more numerous, and more sophisticated than previous estimates suggested. metallurgical capabilities proved more advanced. Astronomical knowledge showed deeper sophistication. Trade networks extended farther. Every new discovery reinforced the alternative interpretation. Political fragmentation and limited funding meant vast regions remained unexplored. Kazakhstan alone contained thousands of unexcavated Bronze Age sites. Mongolia's archaeological survey had barely begun. Siberian territories held countless ruins documented only in travellers' accounts from centuries past. The explored evidence represented a tiny fraction of what existed. What other discoveries waited beneath the steppes? How many Bronze Age cities remained buried under millennia of sediment? What technological capabilities did this civilization possess that evidence hadn't yet revealed? The questions multiplied as findings accumulated, each answer generating new mysteries. The writing systems posed particularly intriguing puzzles. If Bronze Age steppe civilization possessed literacy, why did their texts disappear so completely? Environmental conditions in Central Asia weren't ideal for organic material preservation, but stone inscriptions should survive. Either the civilization used perishable writing materials exclusively, or later populations deliberately destroyed textual evidence. Deliberate destruction seemed plausible, given patterns of cultural amnesia following the Mongol Empire's collapse. Successor states integrated into Chinese, Persian and Russian cultural spheres by downplaying steppe heritage. Destroying or obscuring evidence of sophisticated indigenous civilization served political purposes for both conquerors and conquered elites seeking acceptance. The flood myths preserved across Central Asian cultures contained suspiciously specific details about lost knowledge. Stories described libraries destroyed, scholars drowned, and texts consumed by water. The consistency suggested these weren't generic disaster narratives, but preserved memories of actual knowledge destruction during Bronze Age collapse. Some oral traditions specified that sacred knowledge was deliberately hidden rather than lost. According to these accounts, Bronze Age scholars foreseeing catastrophe concealed their most important texts in protected locations. The stories described underground chambers, mountain caves, and sealed repositories where ancestral wisdom awaited rediscovery. Archaeologists dismiss such tales as fantasy until excavations occasionally confirmed them. Several Bronze Age sites contained sealed chambers with unusual artifact assemblages suggesting archival purposes. The chambers held items that seemed deliberately selected for preservation: astronomical instruments, metallurgical tools, and objects whose purpose remained unclear but suggested specialized knowledge. The legendary accounts of Hyperborea, Shambhala, and other mythical northern kingdoms might preserve distorted memories of Bronze Age civilization. Classical Greek sources described Hyperborea as an advanced northern land beyond the known world. The descriptions matched Central Asian geography, and the cultural characteristics attributed to Hyperboreans, astronomical knowledge, metallurgical skill, spiritual sophistication, aligned with archaeological evidence of Bronze Age capabilities. Tibetan traditions described Shambhala as a northern kingdom, possessing advanced knowledge and serving as a repository for sacred wisdom. The kingdom supposedly existed in physical space, but remained hidden from those unworthy of accessing it. The description could represent metaphorical preservation of Bronze Age knowledge through restricted lineages, accessible only to initiated specialists. These legendary kingdoms weren't fantasies, but cultural memories transformed through millennia of transmission. The details became embellished, the geography mythologized, and the timeline confused, but the core memory remained. Ancestors had possessed civilization of remarkable sophistication that somehow vanished, leaving only fragmentary traces. The truth likely occupied middle ground between conventional history and speculative extremes. Central Asia wasn't wasteland of primitive tribes, nor was it home to impossible super technologies. It hosted a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that collapsed under environmental stress, leaving behind populations who preserved fragments of ancestral achievements through millennia of adaptation. Climate change around 2200 BCE created conditions unprecedented in human experience. The drought severity and duration exceeded anything modern populations have faced. Understanding Bronze Age collapse required imagining civilizational crisis more severe than historical examples, like Rome's fall or the Maya collapse. The environmental catastrophe destroyed infrastructure so completely that later populations could barely comprehend their ancestors' achievements. Yet preservation mechanisms proved remarkably effective. Oral traditions maintained technical knowledge across 4,000 years. Specialized lineages transmitted metallurgical and astronomical expertise through generations. Language preserved conceptual frameworks and vocabulary. Genetic descent maintained biological continuity. The civilization survived transformation that destroyed its material manifestation. The Mongol Empire represented the last great attempt to reunify ancient territories under single authority. Genghis Khan's genius involved recognizing that populations across the steppes shared heritage worth recovering. His systematic collection of specialists, oral traditions, and ancient knowledge fragments assembled a civilizational puzzle that centuries of fragmentation had scattered. The empire's rapid collapse after brief florescence demonstrated that conditions preventing sustained Bronze Age urban civilization persisted. Climate never returned to optimal Bronze Age levels. Political circumstances favored integration into neighboring empires rather than maintaining independent steppe polity. Cultural adaptation to external frameworks proved more viable than preserving distinctive heritage. But the attempt proved that knowledge persisted despite material simplification. Organizational templates survived in oral memory. Technical capabilities remained accessible through specialized lineages. Cultural identity maintained continuity across millennia of political fragmentation. The Bronze Age civilization hadn't died. It transformed, adapted, and waited for circumstances allowing its restoration. Modern archaeology in Central Asia stood at a threshold. New technologies, satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, genetic analysis, computational linguistics, enabled synthesis impossible for earlier generations. The accumulated evidence demanded paradigm shift, acknowledging Bronze Age Central Asian civilization as major historical force rather than peripheral curiosity. Political changes created opportunities as well. Post-Soviet Central Asian nations sought historical narratives emphasizing indigenous achievements rather than colonial civilizing missions. Chinese scholarship increasingly recognized Central Asian influence on Chinese civilization rather than assuming unidirectional cultural flow. The political climate favored research that conventional frameworks had discouraged. Yet vast questions remained unanswered. How extensive was Bronze Age steppe urbanization? What population densities did the civilization support? What writing systems did they use? How did their astronomical knowledge compare with contemporary cultures? What caused the apparent amnesia about their achievements? How much knowledge was deliberately destroyed versus simply lost? The answers waited beneath Central Asian soil, in unexcavated sites numbering in thousands. Each excavation season brought new discoveries, but exploration had barely begun. Funding limitations, political complications, and sheer geographical vastness meant decades or centuries of work remained before comprehensive understanding became possible. The evidence already uncovered proved conventional narratives fundamentally wrong. Central Asian peoples weren't primitive nomads occasionally producing barbarian conquerors. They descended from sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that collapsed but never entirely disappeared. Their periodic reunifications represented descendants recovering ancestral heritage, attempting to restore what environmental catastrophe had destroyed. The whisper of ancient names on medieval maps pointed toward truth that centuries of scholarship had obscured. Tartary wasn't cartographic error or confused designation. It preserved memory of Bronze Age civilization spanning the continent, a memory that survived through oral tradition, genetic descent, and cultural continuity despite deliberate forgetting and scholarly dismissal. The full story awaited discovery, buried beneath steppes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations across 4 millennia. But enough evidence had emerged to demand recognition that human achievement in Central Asia rivaled accomplishments anywhere on Earth. The Bronze Age steppe civilization deserved acknowledgement not as footnote to other cultures' histories, but as major force shaping Eurasian development across millennia. The questions that remained ensured future discoveries would continue rewriting our understanding. Each archaeological season, each genetic study, each linguistic analysis brought humanity closer to comprehending what ancestors had achieved and lost. The evidence we could no longer ignore demanded humility about how much history remained hidden, waiting for scholars willing to question fundamental assumptions and synthesize evidence conventional frameworks had marginalized. The story of the Bronze Age steppe civilization and its descendants proved that knowledge and cultural identity could survive catastrophes that destroyed every material trace. It demonstrated human resilience and the power of deliberate preservation mechanisms to maintain civilization through transformations that seemed like extinction. Most importantly, it revealed how much history remained to be discovered, how many civilizations might have risen and fallen before leaving evidence we've barely begun to recognize.